My son called me embarrassing at my 75th birthday party in front of 200 guests. 3 months later, I signed papers that made him lose everything he thought he'd inherit, packed my Louis Vuitton suitcase, and bought a penthouse overlooking the Mediterranean in Monaco. He thought I was just a naive old woman who'd spent her life baking cookies and hosting family dinners. He had no idea I'd been quietly building an empire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Ashworth, and for 75 years, I thought family meant everything. I built my entire identity around being the perfect mother, the devoted wife, the grandmother who never missed a recital or birthday party. Every Sunday dinner was a production in my sprawling estate in Westchester County, where I'd spend days preparing elaborate meals for ungrateful relatives who showed up with their hands out and their hearts closed. The morning of my birthday party, I stood in my walk-in closet surrounded by decades of carefully chosen outfits, each one selected to project the image everyone expected of me. Conservative dresses in muted colors, sensible shoes, understated jewelry. The uniform of a woman who'd learned to make herself smaller so others could feel bigger. I selected a navy blue dress with pearl buttons, the kind of outfit that whispered respectability and tradition. My housekeeper Maria had been with our family for 30 years, and she knew me better than my own children did. She watched me apply my makeup with the same careful precision I'd used for decades, hiding the sharp intelligence behind gentle eyes, concealing the steel spine beneath silk blouses. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said quietly as she helped me with my necklace, "you look beautiful. Mr. Jonathan should be proud to have such an elegant mother." I smiled at her reflection in the mirror, but something cold had settled in my chest over the past few months. Jonathan, my only child, had been acting differently since his father passed away 2 years ago. Not grief differently, but calculating differently. Like a businessman evaluating assets rather than a son mourning his father. The party was held at the country club where I'd been a member for 40 years. I'd organized charity galas there, hosted countless fundraisers, and donated more money than most people earned in a lifetime. The ballroom was decorated with white roses and gold accents, everything tasteful and traditional, just as I'd always preferred. As guests arrived, I stood in the receiving line wearing my practiced smile, accepting kisses on both cheeks from friends who'd known me since Jonathan was in diapers. The mayor was there, along with several state legislators, local business leaders, and 3 generations of Westchester society families. I'd built relationships with all of them over the decades, not through charm or manipulation, but through genuine generosity and unwavering reliability. What none of them knew was that behind my role as the perfect society matron, I'd been quietly building something extraordinary. My late husband Richard had been a successful attorney, but he'd never known about my private investments, my real estate acquisitions, or the technology companies I'd funded through shell corporations. While he focused on his law practice, I'd turned my inheritance from my grandfather into something that would have shocked him. Jonathan arrived an hour into the party with his wife Melissa and their twin daughters Sophie and Emma, who were both 23 and fresh out of college. He looked every inch the successful investment banker he'd become, wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than Maria's monthly salary. Melissa clung to his arm like an expensive accessory, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her dress chosen to display the jewelry he'd bought her with money he'd never actually earned. "Happy birthday, Mother," Jonathan said, kissing my cheek with the mechanical affection of someone fulfilling an obligation. His embrace felt performative, like he was conscious of the watching crowd and wanted to project the image of a devoted son. The girls were different. Sophie hugged me with genuine warmth, and Emma immediately launched into a story about her new job at an art gallery in Manhattan. They'd inherited their grandfather's artistic sensibilities and their grandmother's sharp minds, though I wasn't sure they realized yet how much intelligence they possessed. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded exactly as these events always did. I moved through the crowd like a gracious hostess, accepting compliments on the decorations, listening to updates about grandchildren and recent vacations, and deflecting the subtle questions about my future plans that wealthy widows always face. The trouble started during the speeches. I'd specifically requested that we keep the formal presentations brief and lighthearted. These were my friends, people who'd known me for decades, and I wanted the evening to feel warm and personal rather than like a stuffy corporate event. Margaret Whitfield, my closest friend since our children were toddlers, spoke first. She shared funny stories about our volunteer work together, our failed attempts at tennis lessons, and the infamous dinner party where I'd accidentally served salt instead of sugar in the dessert. The crowd laughed appreciatively, and I felt a genuine affection of people who'd watched me navigate the challenges of raising a family while maintaining my place in our community. Then Jonathan stepped up to the microphone. I should have known something was wrong by the way he surveyed the room before speaking, like a politician calculating his audience. His smile was too wide, too practiced, and when he began talking, his tone carried an undertone I'd never heard before. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my mother's 75th birthday," he began, and the crowd settled into respectful attention. "As many of you know, my mother has always been the heart of our family. She's dedicated her entire life to taking care of others, organizing charity events, and making sure everyone around her feels welcomed and loved." So far, his words sounded appropriate, even touching, but there was something in his delivery that made my stomach clench with anticipation. "Of course," he continued, and I heard the shift in his voice that signaled danger ahead. "As Mother has gotten older, we've all had to adjust our expectations about what's appropriate for someone her age. Some of her recent choices have been, shall we say, more adventurous than what we're used to seeing from the grandmother we all know and love." The room had gone very quiet. I felt 200 pairs of eyes turning toward me, and suddenly my navy dress felt like a costume I was wearing for a role I no longer wanted to play. Jonathan was referring to my recent decision to take tango lessons at the local dance studio. For 6 months, I'd been learning to dance with a patient instructor named Carlos, who treated me like a woman rather than an elderly relic. The lessons made me feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced since Richard's death. I'd even performed a brief routine at the studio's showcase last month, wearing a red dress that actually fit my figure instead of hiding it. "Some of you may have heard about Mother's new dance hobby," Jonathan continued, and his smile was becoming sharper, more predatory. "While we appreciate her desire to stay active, there comes a time when certain activities become less dignified for someone in her position." My face burned with humiliation as I realized what he was doing. In front of every important person in my social circle, my son was publicly shaming me for daring to pursue something that brought me joy. I think we can all agree that while tango lessons might be appropriate for someone younger, watching a 75-year-old grandmother gyrating on a dance floor is somewhat embarrassing for the family. The word hit me like a physical blow. Embarrassing. My son had just called me embarrassing in front of the...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Mayor, the country club president, 3 generations of my social peers, and my own granddaughters. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see shock on faces throughout the crowd, but also something worse. Pity. People were looking at me like I was a pathetic old woman who'd been gently but publicly corrected by her responsible adult son. "Going forward," Jonathan continued, apparently oblivious to the horror on my face, "the family hopes Mother will focus on more age-appropriate activities. Perhaps more volunteer work with the church, or maybe some quiet hobbies that better suit someone in her stage of life." He actually had the audacity to raise his glass. "To my mother, Victoria Ashworth, a woman who's given her entire life to taking care of others. May her next chapter be filled with the peace and dignity that someone her age deserves." The crowd responded with polite applause, but it sounded hollow and uncomfortable. People were clapping because social convention demanded it, not because they agreed with what they'd just witnessed. I stood there in my conservative dress, surrounded by friends who'd just watched my own son publicly humiliate me, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, but something harder and more dangerous. The carefully constructed image of the gentle, accommodating mother was splitting apart, revealing something underneath that had been patient and waiting for exactly this moment. When the applause died down, I walked to the microphone with the same composure I'd maintained through decades of charity board meetings and social events. My voice was steady, cultured, and absolutely arctic. Thank you, Jonathan, for those illuminating comments about my recent activities, I said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I'm grateful to learn how my family really feels about my attempts to find joy and purpose in my life after losing your father. I could see Jonathan's face beginning to change as he realized that his public rebuke hadn't achieved the result he'd expected. Instead of appearing chastened and grateful for his guidance, I was responding with the kind of controlled fury that made corporate executives nervous during hostile takeovers. However, I think this is an excellent opportunity to share some news about my own future plans. I continued, and now I had the complete attention of every person in that ballroom. After much consideration, I've decided it's time for some significant changes in my life. Changes that I believe will address Jonathan's concerns about age-appropriate behavior. The crowd was hanging on every word. These were people who understood power and politics, and they could sense that something monumental was happening. Effective immediately, I'll be relocating to Monaco, where I've purchased a residence that better suits my current lifestyle preferences. I'll also be making some adjustments to my estate planning to ensure that my assets are distributed in ways that reflect my values and priorities. I could see the color draining from Jonathan's face as he began to understand the implications of what I was saying. But I wasn't finished. I want to thank everyone here tonight for 40 years of friendship and support. You've been a wonderful community, and I'll miss our regular interactions. However, I find that at 75, I'm finally ready to stop living my life according to other people's expectations of what's appropriate for someone my age. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a champagne flute drop. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. The bar will remain open, and the band will continue playing for anyone who'd like to dance, though perhaps only those who meet the family's standards for age-appropriate gyration. I walked off that stage and out of that ballroom with my head high and my spine straight, leaving behind 200 stunned guests and one son who'd just realized he'd made the most expensive mistake of his life. In the car driving home, Maria sat quietly in the passenger seat, while I stared out the window at the familiar streets of the Norate neighborhood where I'd lived for 40 years. Everything looked the same, but I felt like a completely different person than the woman who'd gotten dressed for her birthday party that morning. "Mrs. Ashworth," Maria finally said, "did you mean what you said about Monaco?" I turned to look at this woman who'd been more loyal to me than my own child, who'd watched me shrink myself down year after year to fit into boxes other people had built for me. "Every word," I said. "And Maria, if you're willing, I'd like you to come with me. It's time for both of us to start living like the powerful women we actually are, instead of pretending to be the diminished versions everyone expects us to be." The look on her face told me everything I needed to know about how ready she was for that adventure. When we arrived home, I walked through the rooms of the house where I'd raised Jonathan, where I'd hosted countless dinner parties and charity meetings, where I'd played the role of the perfect wife and mother for decades. But instead of nostalgia, I felt something closer to relief. Tomorrow, I would call my private attorney, the one Jonathan had never met, and begin the process of restructuring my estate in ways that would ensure my wealth supported causes I actually believed in, rather than funding the lifestyle of a son who saw me as an embarrassment. Tomorrow, I would also call my real estate agent in Monaco and finalize the purchase of the penthouse I'd been secretly considering for months. The one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Mediterranean, the one with enough space for tango lessons and dinner parties for the kind of people who celebrated, rather than criticized women who refused to fade quietly into the background. But tonight, I poured myself a glass of the expensive wine I'd been saving for special occasions, and called Carlos, my dance instructor. "Victoria," he said, and I could hear the warmth in his voice that had been missing from my son's greeting all evening. "How was your birthday celebration?" "Illuminating," I said. "Carlos, how would you feel about teaching tango lessons in Monte Carlo?" The pause on the other end of the line was brief, and then he laughed with genuine delight. "When do we leave?" As I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was about to make decisions based entirely on what I wanted rather than what other people expected from me. The embarrassing old woman my son had described in front of all my friends was about to disappear forever. In her place, someone much more dangerous was emerging. Someone who'd spent 75 years learning how power really worked, who'd quietly accumulated more wealth than most people could imagine, and who was finally ready to stop pretending to be harmless. Jonathan had wanted me to behave in ways that were appropriate for someone my age. He was about to discover that what was truly appropriate for a woman of my age, experience, and resources was absolutely nothing like what he'd expected. The next morning, I woke up in my familiar bedroom for what I suspected might be one of the last times. Sunlight streamed through the curtains I'd chosen 20 years ago, illuminating the antique furniture Richard and I had collected during our travels. Everything was exactly as I'd left it the night before, but the woman lying in that bed was fundamentally different from the one who'd gotten dressed for her birthday party. I'd barely finished my morning coffee when my phone started ringing. Jonathan's name appeared on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By the time I'd showered and dressed, he'd called 6 times and left 3 increasingly frantic messages. The doorbell rang at 9:30, followed immediately by aggressive knocking. Through the peephole, I could see Jonathan pacing on my front porch like a caged animal. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and he was wearing the same suit from the night before, wrinkled now and stained with what looked like coffee. I opened the door and stepped back to let him enter, noting how his eyes immediately began cataloging the valuable items in my foyer as if he were conducting an inventory. "Mother, what the hell was that performance last night?" he demanded, his voice pitched higher than usual with panic. "Do you have any idea how that looked? How it reflected on the family?" I walked to my living room and settled into the wingback chair where I'd read thousands of books over the years, the one that gave me a clear view of his face while positioning me slightly above his eye level. Body language lessons from decades of charity board meetings where I'd learned to project authority while appearing non-threatening. I thought it looked like a woman finally speaking honestly about her circumstances. I said calmly, "Please, sit down. You seem agitated." He ignored my invitation to sit, instead pacing around my coffee table like he was giving a closing argument to a hostile jury. "Agitated? Mother, you publicly humiliated me in front of everyone we know. You made it sound like I was some kind of monster for expressing concern about your dignity." The word choice was interesting. Not his concern for my happiness or well-being, but my dignity. As if the most important thing about my life was how it appeared to other people. "Jonathan," I said, and my voice carried the tone I'd perfected during 40 years of managing difficult personalities on nonprofit boards. "Last night, you called me embarrassing in front of 200 people because I've been taking dance lessons. You suggested that I was too old and too undignified to pursue activities that bring me joy. How exactly did you expect me to respond to that?" His face flushed red, but not with shame, with the kind of anger that comes from being held accountable for behavior you thought you could get away with. "I was trying to protect you from making a fool of yourself. Do you know what people have been saying about those dance lessons? About the way you've been dressing? About that red dress you wore to that showcase?" There it was. The real issue wasn't my behavior, it was how my behavior reflected on him. I'd been embarrassing him not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I was finally doing something that made me visible in ways that didn't serve his image. "What people, Jonathan? Which specific people have expressed concerns about my tango lessons?" The question caught him off guard, and he stumbled over his response. "Well, everyone's talking about it. Melissa heard from her book club that some of the women thought it was inappropriate for someone your age to be so physical in public." Melissa's book club. The wives of men who controlled trust funds and family businesses, women whose opinions mattered because their husbands' approval could affect Jonathan's career prospects in the insular world of Westchester finance. I'd spent my entire adult life navigating the complex social hierarchies of old money communities, where appearances mattered more than substance, and where stepping outside prescribed roles could have real consequences for your family's standing. But I'd also learned something that Jonathan apparently hadn't. Real power came from controlling resources, not from seeking approval. "I see," I said. "So your concern isn't actually about my well-being or happiness. It's about how my choices might affect your social standing." "That's not fair, Mother. Of course I care about your happiness, but there are appropriate ways for someone in your position to find fulfillment, and gyrating on a dance floor in front of strangers isn't one of them." The word, gyrating, again. He was reducing the elegant, passionate art of tango to something crude and sexual, as if a woman my age expressing grace and sensuality was inherently shameful. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window that overlooked the garden Richard and I had designed together. The roses were in full bloom, and I could see Maria deadheading the spent flowers with the careful attention she brought to everything in her life. "Jonathan, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. When you look at me, what do you see?" He shifted uncomfortably behind me, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "I see my mother. A woman who's given her life to taking care of her family, who deserves respect and comfort in her final years. Final years. As if at 75 I was already dying instead of potentially entering the most interesting phase of my life." "That's very diplomatic," I said, still facing the garden. "But what I think you actually see is an elderly woman whose primary value lies in her ability to provide financial support for your lifestyle, while maintaining a low profile that doesn't complicate your social aspirations." The silence behind me stretched long enough to confirm that my assessment was accurate. "When your father died," I continued, "you didn't ask me how I was coping with the loss of my partner of 48 years. You didn't ask what I needed to heal, or how you could support me through grief. The first thing you asked about was whether I'd need help managing my finances." I turned around to face him, and I could see the truth in his expression before he even attempted to deny it. "You've been waiting for me to become the kind of elderly widow who hands over her decision-making to her responsible adult son. You want me to be grateful for your guidance and generous with your inheritance. What you don't want is a mother who has her own ideas about how to spend her remaining years. Mother, that's ridiculous. I've never said anything about your money or inheritance." But his eyes betrayed him, flicking automatically toward the artwork on my walls, the antique furniture, the obvious signs of wealth that he'd been mentally cataloging since the moment he walked in. "You haven't said anything directly," I agreed. "But last night you made it very clear that you think my role in this family is to behave in ways that make you comfortable, regardless of what makes me happy. That tells me everything I need to know about how you view our relationship." I walked back to my chair and pulled out a manila folder I'd placed there before he arrived. "So I've made some decisions that I think will address your concerns about my age-appropriate behavior." The look on his face was pure terror, as I opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. "These are the contracts for my new residence in Monaco. A penthouse in Monte Carlo, with panoramic views of the Mediterranean, where I'll be spending the majority of my time going forward." He stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "Monaco? Mother, you can't be serious. You don't know anyone there. You don't speak French. What would you do with yourself?" "I speak French fluently, actually. I've been taking lessons for 3 years, and I know several people there already, including some very interesting individuals I've met through my investments in European art galleries and technology companies." That was the first crack in the facade I'd been maintaining for 75 years. Jonathan had no idea that I spoke multiple languages, that I had business interests outside of the United States, or that I'd been quietly building a network of international contacts for decades. "Investments? What investments, Mother? What are you talking about?" I reached for another folder, this one significantly thicker than the first. "I suppose now is as good a time as any to discuss the full scope of my financial situation," I said, enjoying the way his face went pale as I laid out documents that represented just a fraction of my actual holdings. "This is my portfolio summary as of last month. Real estate holdings in 6 countries, equity stakes in 12 technology companies, and what I believe most people would consider a substantial art collection, housed in climate-controlled storage facilities in New York, London, and Geneva." The numbers on the papers made Jonathan sink into the couch, as if his legs had suddenly given out. "I don't understand," he said weakly. "Where did all this come from? Dad never mentioned any of this. Your father was a brilliant attorney and a wonderful husband, but he wasn't particularly interested in financial strategy beyond his law practice. What he didn't know was that I'd been investing my inheritance from Grandfather Hartwell since before you were born. My grandfather had been a railroad baron who'd left me a trust fund that most people assumed was modest. What they didn't know was that he'd taught me to think like an entrepreneur before I was old enough to understand that women weren't supposed to be good at business." I've spent 50 years turning that initial inheritance into something that could provide security for our family for generations. The problem is, I no longer believe that our family shares my values about how that wealth should be used. Jonathan was staring at the portfolio summary like it contained nuclear launch codes. What do you mean? Mother, of course we share your values. I've always respected your commitment to charity and family. Have you? Because last night you made it very clear that you think my primary obligation is to behave in ways that don't embarrass you socially. That doesn't sound like someone who respects my autonomy or judgment. I pulled out the final set of documents, the ones that would change everything. So I've made some adjustments to my estate planning that I think better reflect my current priorities. The new will was 43 pages long, and I watched Jonathan's face as he scanned the first few pages. The charitable foundation I'd established would receive the majority of my assets, with specific allocations for dance education programs, women's empowerment initiatives, and support for elderly individuals who wanted to pursue non-traditional lifestyle choices. His inheritance had been reduced to a trust fund that would provide a comfortable but not extravagant income, with strict conditions about how the money could be used. No luxury purchases, no speculation investments, and absolutely no access to the principal without approval from the foundation's board of directors. This can't be legal, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You can't just cut your own son out of his inheritance because he hurt your feelings. I'm not cutting you out, Jonathan. I'm ensuring that your inheritance comes with the same kind of oversight and restrictions that you seem to think are appropriate for my life choices. The irony was perfect, and I could see him beginning to understand the symmetry of what I'd done. But the house, the properties, the art collection. Mother, that's my children's legacy. You can't just give it all away to strangers. Strangers? The beneficiaries of my new will include dance studios that provide free lessons to elderly students, organizations that help women start businesses after age 60, and foundations that support artistic education for young people. That doesn't sound like strangers to me. That sounds like the kind of legacy I want to leave. He was still staring at the documents like they might change if he looked at them long enough. What about Sophie and Emma? They're your granddaughters. Surely you're not going to punish them for something I said. Your daughters will each receive full funding for graduate school or professional training, plus trust funds that will provide security without enabling laziness. The difference is, their inheritances come with encouragement to pursue their passions, rather than restrictions designed to make other people comfortable. The contrast was deliberate. Sophie and Emma would inherit freedom and opportunity. Jonathan would inherit exactly the kind of controlled, supervised existence he'd tried to impose on me. And of course, I added, they're welcome to visit me in Monaco anytime they'd like to experience what it looks like when someone their grandmother's age refuses to apologize for taking up space in the world. That's when Jonathan finally lost his composure completely. This is insane. You're making life-altering decisions based on one comment at a birthday party. You're throwing away everything Dad worked for, everything our family built, because I suggested that tango lessons might not be appropriate for someone your age. His voice had risen to nearly a shout, and I could see the entitled rage that had always lurked beneath his polite facade finally breaking through. You're punishing me for trying to protect you from embarrassing yourself. You're destroying our family because I had the courage to tell you something everyone else was thinking but was too polite to say. There it was. The truth he'd been dancing around since he walked in. He genuinely believed that his public humiliation of me had been an act of courage, that he'd been protecting me from social consequences I was too naive to understand. I stood up again and walked to the mantelpiece where photos of our family lined the marble surface. Pictures of Jonathan as a baby, as a school child, at his graduation from college and business school. Photos of his wedding, of Sophie and Emma as toddlers. In every single picture I was there. Supporting, celebrating, providing the stable foundation that allowed everyone else to pursue their dreams, while taking my own sacrifices for granted. Jonathan, I said quietly, do you remember when you were 12 and wanted to quit piano lessons to focus on baseball? The change of subject clearly confused him, but he nodded. You said the piano was embarrassing, that none of your friends had to take lessons, that it made you different in ways you didn't want to be different. Do you remember what I told you? His face went very still as he began to understand where this was going. I told you that pursuing something you loved was never embarrassing, even if other people didn't understand it. I told you that the opinions of people who wanted to make you smaller weren't worth considering. I told you that you should never let anyone convince you to give up something that brought you joy just because it made them uncomfortable. I turned away from the photos to face my son directly. Last night, you did to me exactly what those 12-year-old boys tried to do to you. You tried to shame me into giving up something I love because it didn't fit your image of who you think I should be. The parallel was devastating, and I could see him struggling to find a response that didn't confirm exactly how hypocritical his behavior had been. "That's not the same thing," he said finally. "You were a child then. Children need encouragement to develop their talents. But there are different standards for different stages of life." "Different standards? You mean lower standards? You mean that at 75 I should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity you're willing to allow me, rather than insisting on the same respect and autonomy you expect for yourself?" I walked to the front door and opened it, a clear signal that our conversation was over. "I'll be leaving for Monaco in 2 weeks. The house will be donated to a non-profit that provides housing for women escaping domestic violence. My attorney will handle the details of the estate transfer, and Maria will forward any personal belongings you'd like to keep." Jonathan remained on the couch, staring at the documents that had just redistributed his entire future. "You can contact me through my attorney if you have questions about the legal arrangements. But Jonathan, I want you to understand something very clearly. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a phase I'm going through, or a decision I might reconsider if you apologize sincerely enough." I stepped aside so he could see the open door. "This is me finally living according to the same advice I gave you when you were 12. Never let anyone convince you to give up something that brings you joy, just because it makes them uncomfortable." He stood up slowly, moving like a man who'd just survived a car accident and wasn't sure which parts of his body were still working. "Mother, please, let's talk about this rationally. I'm sure we can find a compromise that works for everyone." The time for compromise was before you decided to publicly humiliate me at my own birthday party. Now the only rational response is for me to build a life where that kind of treatment isn't possible. He walked past me toward the door, then turned back one final time. "What am I supposed to tell people? How do I explain that my mother moved to Monaco and gave away the family fortune because I hurt her feelings?" The question revealed everything about his priorities. Even now, facing the complete collapse of his expectations, his primary concern was how this would look to other people. "Tell them the truth, Jonathan. Tell them that your mother turned out to be far more powerful than anyone realized, and that she decided to use that power to support people who celebrate strong women instead of trying to diminish them." I closed the door behind him and walked back to my living room, where the documents of my new life lay scattered across the coffee table, like battle plans for a war I'd finally decided to win. Through the window I could see Jonathan sitting in his car in my driveway, his head in his hands, probably calculating how much money he'd just lost by calling me embarrassing in front of everyone we knew. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking about Jonathan at all. I was thinking about the penthouse in Monaco, where I'd be hosting tango lessons on a terrace overlooking the Mediterranean. I was thinking about the art galleries I'd be visiting, the restaurants where I'd be dining, the powerful and interesting people I'd be meeting who valued intelligence and independence over age-appropriate behavior. Most of all, I was thinking about the woman I was about to become, someone who'd spent 75 years learning how to navigate the world, who'd quietly accumulated more power than anyone suspected, and who was finally ready to stop pretending to be harmless. The embarrassing old woman my son had described was gone forever. In her place, someone much more dangerous was taking control of her own story, and that story was just beginning. 2 weeks after my conversation with Jonathan, I stood in the marble foyer of my Westchester home for the final time, watching a team of professional movers carefully wrap the last of my personal belongings. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if removing my emotional attachment to it had physically changed its atmosphere. Maria bustled around with her characteristic efficiency, directing the movers with the authority of someone who'd managed household staff across 3 decades. The doorbell chimed, and through the sidelight windows I could see a sleek black car in my circular driveway. My attorney, Patricia Thornbridge, emerged from the back seat carrying the leather portfolio that contained the final documents I needed to sign before my departure. Patricia had been handling my private legal affairs for 15 years, completely separate from the family attorney who'd managed Richard's practice and our joint holdings. "Victoria," she said as I opened the door, "everything is proceeding exactly as planned. The foundation paperwork has been filed, the Monaco residence transfer is complete, and your new banking arrangements are fully operational." We settled in my study, the one room I'd kept exactly as it was until this final day. The built-in bookcases still held first editions I'd collected over decades, and the massive oak desk where I'd managed my secret investments still dominated the space. Tomorrow, all of it would belong to the women's shelter that would convert this house into transitional housing for domestic violence survivors. "I've brought the final transfer documents," Patricia continued, spreading papers across the desk with practiced precision. "Once you sign these, the conversion of your assets will be irrevocable. Are you absolutely certain about this decision?" I looked around the study where I'd spent countless hours building the financial empire that had funded Jonathan's education, his house, his lifestyle, and his assumptions about his future inheritance. Every leather-bound book represented knowledge I'd acquired independently. Every investment statement represented risks I'd taken while appearing to be nothing more than a devoted wife and mother. "Patricia, I've never been more certain of anything in my life." As I signed each document, I felt the weight of 75 years of other people's expectations lifting from my shoulders. The woman who'd spent decades making herself smaller to accommodate everyone else's comfort was disappearing with each signature, replaced by someone who'd finally decided to take up the space she'd always been entitled to occupy. "There is one more matter," Patricia said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Jonathan's attorney contacted my office yesterday requesting a meeting to discuss potential challenges to your estate planning decisions." I wasn't surprised. Jonathan had spent 2 weeks consulting with various legal experts, trying to find a way to overturn changes that would cost him millions of dollars. The entitled rage he'd displayed in my living room had undoubtedly intensified as he'd calculated the full scope of his losses. What kind of challenges? Mental competency, undue influence, the standard arguments family members make when they've been cut out of wills they assumed they'd inherit. Unfortunately for Jonathan, your psychological evaluations are recent and comprehensive, your decision-making process has been methodical and well documented, and there's absolutely no evidence of outside manipulation. I'd anticipated this possibility and had spent months establishing an unshakable legal foundation for my choices. The psychological evaluations Patricia mentioned had been conducted by 3 independent specialists, all of whom had concluded that I was operating at peak cognitive function, with exceptional emotional intelligence and clear decision-making capabilities. More importantly, Patricia continued, the recordings I've obtained make any competency challenge essentially impossible. My breath caught. What recordings? Patricia's smile was sharp and satisfied. "It seems that Jonathan has been quite vocal about his opinions regarding your mental state and his expectations about your inheritance. Several of these conversations were captured by security systems at the country club, his office building, and various social events over the past 6 months." She pressed play on a small digital device, and Jonathan's voice filled my study with crystal clarity. "Mother's obviously not thinking clearly since Dad died. All this nonsense about dance lessons and independence is just grief making her act irrationally. Once I get power of attorney, I can clean up this mess and get her settled somewhere appropriate." The recording was from a conversation at the country club bar, and I could hear other voices in the background expressing agreement and offering advice about managing elderly parents who'd become difficult. "There's more," Patricia said, fast-forwarding through the audio. "This one was recorded at a business dinner 3 weeks ago. Jonathan's voice again, more confident this time, speaking to what sounded like a group of colleagues. The thing about these old money families is that the wealth always gets passed down eventually, regardless of whatever temporary insanity the older generation goes through. My mother thinks she's making some kind of feminist statement, but realistically, who else is she going to leave everything to? I'm her only child. Basic biology and inheritance law are on my side. I listened to my son discussing my life and decisions like I was already dead, calculating how long he'd need to wait before gaining access to assets he'd never earned, and apparently felt entitled to inherit simply by virtue of existing. The most damaging recording," Patricia said, "was captured at Melissa's book club meeting last week. This time it was my daughter-in-law's voice. sharp with frustration and unmistakable greed. Victoria's little rebellion is costing us millions of dollars. Jonathan's been too nice about this whole situation, too willing to accommodate her delusions about being some kind of independent woman. If this was my mother, I'd have her declared incompetent and committed somewhere she couldn't cause any more financial damage. The other women at the book club murmured agreement, and I could hear someone suggesting specific facilities where difficult elderly relatives could be managed discreetly. I've researched the process, Melissa continued. With the right medical professionals and the right legal strategy, we could have her declared mentally unfit within 6 months. Then Jonathan gets guardianship. We reverse all these ridiculous charitable donations, and we can finally access the money that should have been ours years ago. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with these women discussing my future like I was a business problem to be solved rather than a human being with rights and autonomy. They'd clearly researched elder abuse tactics, identified cooperative medical professionals, and planned a systematic approach to stripping away my independence. Patricia turned off the recording and looked at me with the expression of an attorney who just received the perfect evidence for an unwinnable case. Victoria, these recordings document clear intent to commit elder abuse and financial exploitation. If Jonathan or Melissa make any move to challenge your competency or your legal decisions, these conversations will become exhibits in a criminal case rather than a civil dispute. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I processed what I'd just heard. My son and his wife hadn't just been disappointed by my decision to restructure my estate. They'd been actively planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could steal my autonomy and my assets. How did you obtain these recordings? I didn't obtain them. They were provided by concerned members of your community who felt that potential elder abuse should be documented and reported to appropriate authorities. The implications were staggering. People I'd known for decades, friends who'd attended my birthday party and witnessed Jonathan's public humiliation of me, had been monitoring his subsequent behavior and ensuring that any attempt to harm me would be thoroughly documented. Who provided them? Margaret Whitfield coordinated the effort, but the recordings came from multiple sources. Apparently your friends were quite disturbed by Jonathan's speech at your birthday party and decided to protect you from any retaliation. Margaret, my closest friend for 40 years, had organized a covert intelligence operation to protect me from my own son. The network of relationships I'd built through decades of charity work and community involvement had transformed into a security system that was more effective than any private investigation firm. There's something else, Patricia said, pulling out a thick file folder. Margaret asked me to give you this compilation of information about Jonathan and Melissa's financial situation. She thought you should understand the full scope of what's been happening behind the scenes. The folder contained bank statements, credit reports, and financial records that painted a devastating picture of my son's economic reality. Despite his successful career and substantial income, Jonathan and Melissa were drowning in debt. They'd been living far beyond their means for years, funding a lifestyle that depended entirely on the assumption that they'd eventually inherit my wealth. The country club membership, the private school tuition for the girls, the luxury cars, the European vacations, the designer clothing that had always made them appear so successful were all financed through credit lines secured against their expected inheritance. They owed nearly $2 million to various creditors, with minimum payments that consumed almost half of Jonathan's monthly income. They've been borrowing against your estate for over 5 years, Patricia explained. Every major purchase, every lifestyle upgrade, every investment in their social status was made with money they assumed they'd inherit from you. I studied the financial documents, understanding for the first time why Jonathan had been so confident about his eventual inheritance, why he'd felt entitled to speak about my life choices, as if they were business decisions that affected his portfolio. The dance lessons weren't just embarrassing to him socially, I said, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. They represented a threat to his financial survival. Exactly. A mother who was taking tango lessons and buying red dresses and refusing to behave like a traditional elderly widow was a mother who might make unconventional decisions about her estate planning. They needed you to remain predictable, controllable, and grateful for their guidance. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. My son hadn't been concerned about my dignity or my reputation. He'd been terrified that my growing independence would interfere with his ability to access money he'd already spent. The most telling document, Patricia continued, is this loan application from 6 months ago. She handed me paperwork showing that Jonathan had attempted to secure a bridge loan using my house as collateral, claiming that he had power of attorney over my affairs due to my, quote, declining mental capacity following my husband's death. The loan had been denied because the bank's verification process had revealed that no such power of attorney existed, but the application itself was evidence of fraud and attempted elder abuse. He's been telling creditors that he has legal control over your assets for the past year, according to these records. He's been using your wealth as collateral for his debts while simultaneously working to gain actual legal control over your finances. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. While I'd been grieving Richard's death and slowly rebuilding my sense of independence, Jonathan had been systematically laying the groundwork to strip away my autonomy and steal my life's work. Patricia, I want these recordings and financial documents sent to the district attorney's office. If Jonathan wants to challenge my competency, he can explain his attempted fraud and elder abuse plans to a criminal prosecutor. Already done. The DA's office opened an investigation yesterday. Jonathan and Melissa don't know yet, but they're both under criminal investigation for attempted elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud. I felt a savage satisfaction at the thought of my son discovering that his attempts to manipulate and control me had instead landed him in legal jeopardy that could result in prison time and financial ruin. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown Monaco number. Madam Ashworth, your residence is prepared for your arrival. The staff is eager to welcome you home. Henri, building concierge. Home. For the first time in decades, I was moving towards something I'd chosen entirely for myself, rather than away from something that had become unbearable. I think that concludes our business here, I said, standing and extending my hand to Patricia. Thank you for handling everything so efficiently. It's been my privilege, Victoria. I've represented many wealthy clients over the years, but I've never seen anyone execute such a complete transformation with such strategic precision. You've essentially reinvented yourself while simultaneously protecting yourself from people who wanted to exploit you. As Patricia gathered her papers, I walked to the window that overlooked the garden where I'd spent countless hours pretending to be content with a diminished life. Tomorrow, I'd be waking up in a penthouse overlooking the Mediterranean, where I'd never again have to apologize for taking up space in the world. The movers finished loading the last boxes into their truck, and Maria appeared in the doorway of my study carrying the small suitcase that contained everything I needed for my new life. Mrs. Ashworth, the car to the airport is here. I took one final look around the room where I'd secretly built an empire while playing the role of a traditional wife and mother. The woman who'd sat at that desk for decades, carefully hiding her intelligence and ambition behind charitable activities and social obligations, was gone forever. The woman walking out of that house was someone entirely different, powerful, independent, and absolutely done with making herself smaller to accommodate other people's expectations. As our car pulled away from the house where I'd raised Jonathan, I didn't look back. Instead, I pulled out my phone and sent a text message to Carlos, my tango instructor, who was flying to Monaco separately, looking forward to our first lesson on the terrace tomorrow evening. I have a feeling this new chapter is going to be extraordinary. His response came immediately. Madame, you have no idea how extraordinary it's going to be. The flight to Monaco was uneventful, but everything else about the experience was a revelation. Flying first class internationally was something I'd done many times with Richard. But this trip felt completely different. I wasn't traveling as someone's wife or mother or the respectable widow who needed protection and guidance. I was traveling as Victoria Ashworth, a powerful woman who'd decided to relocate to one of the most exclusive destinations in the world, because she could afford to do whatever she wanted. The flight attendants treated me with the deference that comes from recognizing genuine wealth and authority. Other passengers nodded respectfully when we made eye contact. I'd always possessed this level of financial power, but I'd never allowed myself to inhabit it fully. When we landed in Nice, a private car was waiting to transport me to Monaco. The driver, a distinguished gentleman named Philippe, spoke perfect English with a slight French accent and treated me like visiting royalty. Madame Ashworth, welcome to the Côte d'Azur. I hope your flight was comfortable. Monsieur Henri asked me to inform you that your residence is fully prepared, and he has arranged for several local services to introduce themselves at your convenience. The drive along the Mediterranean coast was spectacular, with azure water stretching endlessly toward the horizon, and elegant villas perched on cliffs overlooking the sea. As we entered Monaco, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of rightness that I hadn't experienced since before Richard's death. This wasn't just a change of address. This was a complete transformation into the person I'd always been underneath the roles everyone else had required me to play. My new building was a masterpiece of contemporary architecture, with clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that maximized the stunning coastal views. Henri, the concierge, met me in the marble lobby with the efficiency of someone accustomed to serving demanding international clientele. Madam Ashworth, it is our great pleasure to welcome you to your new home. Your penthouse has been prepared according to your specifications, and I have arranged for introductions to several local services that I believe will interest you. The elevator rose smoothly to the top floor, and when the doors opened directly into my new residence, I felt my breath catch. The space was everything I'd hoped for and more: vast rooms with soaring ceilings, contemporary furnishings that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, and windows that offered panoramic views of the Mediterranean and the Monaco harbor. But the most striking feature was the terrace, a massive outdoor space with multiple seating areas, a dining section, and a dance floor with professional quality sound equipment already installed. Carlos helped design the terrace layout, Henri explained, noting my surprise. He wanted to ensure the space would be perfect for both private lessons and entertaining guests who appreciate fine dancing. Maria appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, beaming with excitement as she surveyed our new surroundings. Mrs. Ashworth, this place is magnificent. The kitchen is a dream, and my apartment downstairs is larger than my entire house back home. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about the future. This wasn't just a comfortable place to spend my remaining years. This was a launching pad for adventures I'd never allowed myself to imagine. Henri, you mentioned introductions to local services. Indeed. I have arranged for you to meet with several individuals who provide services to our most discerning residents. There is Madame Dubois, who operates the most exclusive salon in Monaco, Monsieur Laurent, who is considered the finest personal stylist on the Riviera, and Madame Chen, who organizes cultural and social events for international residents who appreciate intellectual stimulation. Within hours of arriving, I found myself immersed in a world I'd never known existed. The salon appointment with Madame Dubois resulted in a complete transformation of my appearance. Gone was the conservative hairstyle I'd maintained for decades, replaced by a sophisticated cut that was both age-appropriate and undeniably glamorous. The session with Monsieur Laurent was even more revelatory. He took one look at my conservative wardrobe and shook his head with dramatic disapproval. Madame, you have the bearing and elegance of true aristocracy, but you are hiding it beneath clothes that apologize for your existence. This will not do. Not in Monaco. Not at your age, when you should be celebrating everything you have accomplished. He spent 3 hours creating a new wardrobe that emphasized my best features while projecting the authority and sophistication I'd always possessed but never allowed myself to display. Rich colors that complemented my silver hair, luxurious fabrics that felt sensual against my skin, and silhouettes that commanded attention rather than deflecting it. Remember, madame, he said as he packed away my old clothes for donation, you are no longer dressing for other people's comfort. You are dressing for your own pleasure and power. The meeting with Madame Chen was the most intriguing of all. She was a Chinese-American woman in her 60s who'd moved to Monaco after selling a successful tech company in Silicon Valley. Her apartment was filled with contemporary art and books in multiple languages, and she radiated the kind of intellectual energy I'd been craving for years. Victoria, Henri tells me you're interested in cultural and social opportunities that challenge rather than coddle. I think you'll find Monaco's international community much more stimulating than whatever you've left behind. She described a network of accomplished expatriates who'd chosen Monaco not just for its tax advantages but for its unique combination of luxury and intellectual freedom. Artists, entrepreneurs, writers, and business leaders who valued substance over social convention. We have a dinner party next week for a visiting philosopher from Oxford who's written a fascinating book about reinvention in later life. Would you be interested in joining us? I accepted immediately, feeling more energized than I had in years. That evening, Carlos arrived for our first tango lesson on my new terrace. He'd changed too, trading his conservative dance studio attire for clothes that reflected the sophisticated international environment we now inhabited. "Victoria, you look absolutely magnificent," he said, and I could see genuine admiration in his eyes. "This transformation suits you completely." As we began dancing, with the Mediterranean sunset providing a backdrop that was more beautiful than any ballroom, I felt the final pieces of my old life falling away. The woman who'd been embarrassed by her son for pursuing something that brought her joy was gone forever. In her place was someone who'd decided that at 75, she was finally ready to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The music swelled, and Carlos spun me across the terrace with professional grace. Below us, the lights of Monaco glittered like jewels, and in the distance, I could see yachts anchored in the harbor, where tomorrow I might be having lunch with international art dealers or technology entrepreneurs. My phone buzzed with messages from Westchester friends who'd heard about my move and wanted to express their support, but I ignored them all. The woman who'd needed their approval and protection was gone. The woman dancing tango on a penthouse terrace overlooking the Mediterranean was just getting started. "Carlos," I said as we finished our first dance in our new home, "I have a feeling this is going to be the most interesting chapter of my life." His smile was brilliant as he prepared for our next dance. "Madame Victoria, I guarantee it." As the music began again, I caught my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new home. The woman looking back at me was elegant, powerful, and completely unashamed of taking up exactly as much space as she wanted. For the first time in 75 years, I was living entirely for myself. And it felt absolutely extraordinary. 6 months into my new life in Monaco, I was hosting my third dinner party on the penthouse terrace when my phone rang with a call from Patricia. The evening was perfect, with a gentle Mediterranean breeze carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden boxes I'd installed along the terrace walls. My guests included a Russian art collector, a British tech entrepreneur who'd revolutionized online education, and a French novelist whose latest work was being adapted for film. The conversation flowing around my dining table was the kind of intellectual discourse I'd craved for decades, but never found in Westchester social circles. These were people who'd built their own fortunes, created their own destinies, and refused to let age or convention limit their ambitions. In their company, I felt more like myself than I had since my early 20s. "Excuse me for just a moment," I said to my guests, stepping inside to take Patricia's call in private. "Victoria, I'm calling with an update on the Jonathan situation. The district attorney's office has completed their investigation, and they're ready to proceed with formal charges." I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Monte Carlo's glittering harbor, where yachts worth more than most people's houses swayed gently in the moonlight. "What kind of charges?" "Attempted elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit guardianship abuse. The evidence is overwhelming, particularly those recordings of Melissa discussing strategies for having you declared incompetent. They're looking at potential prison sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years. Through the glass, I could see my dinner guests laughing at something the novelist had said, their faces animated with the kind of joy that comes from being genuinely engaged with life and ideas. This was the world I'd chosen instead of the narrow, suffocating existence my son had tried to impose on me. "There's more," Patricia continued. "Jonathan's creditors have begun foreclosure proceedings on his house. Without access to your inheritance, he can't maintain the lifestyle he's been financing on credit for years. The country club membership has been suspended due to unpaid dues, and the girls have had to withdraw from their private schools." I felt a complex mixture of emotions processing this information. The maternal part of me that had spent 35 years protecting and providing for Jonathan experienced a pang of sympathy for his financial collapse. But the woman who'd been publicly humiliated and privately betrayed felt something closer to satisfaction. "What about Sophie and Emma? They've both reached out to your attorney requesting meetings. Apparently they had no knowledge of their parents, plans to have you declared incompetent, and they're horrified by the criminal charges. They want to apologize and see if there's any possibility of maintaining a relationship with you." My granddaughters were different from their parents. During my years of playing the traditional grandmother role, I'd watched them develop into thoughtful, independent young women who possessed both intelligence and integrity. Unlike Jonathan, they'd never shown signs of entitlement or greed, and they genuinely seemed to enjoy our time together. Have them call me directly. I'd like to hear what they have to say. There's one final matter. Jonathan himself has requested a meeting. His attorney contacted my office, claiming he wants to make amends and discuss a possible reconciliation. I laughed, and the sound carried an edge I wouldn't have recognized 6 months ago. I imagine he's primarily interested in discussing whether criminal charges might disappear if our family disagreement could be resolved privately. That would be my assessment as well. His attorney has hinted at willingness to accept a plea bargain that might involve restitution rather than prison time, assuming you'd be willing to negotiate. I looked back at my dinner party, where the art collector was now showing photographs of a recent acquisition on his phone, while the others leaned in with genuine interest. These people had sought me out not because they needed something from me, but because they found me intellectually stimulating and socially engaging. Patricia, please inform Jonathan's attorney that I'm not interested in any negotiations. He chose to treat me like an obstacle to his inheritance, rather than like his mother. Now he can face the consequences of those choices without my intervention. I'll convey that message. And Victoria, if I may say so, you sound like a completely different person than the woman I met 2 years ago when you first started planning this transition. She was right. The woman who'd made that first appointment with Patricia had been someone seeking escape from an unbearable situation. The woman living in Monaco was someone who'd discovered that freedom could be more intoxicating than she'd ever imagined. I returned to my guests and found them debating the ethics of artificial intelligence in creative industries, a conversation that was both sophisticated and passionate. The tech entrepreneur was arguing that AI could democratize artistic creation, while the novelist maintained that human consciousness was irreplaceable in meaningful art. Victoria, the art collector, said as I rejoined the group, "We need your perspective." As someone who's made the transition from traditional philanthropy to more innovative cultural investments, how do you see technology changing the art world? The question reflected how my new community perceived me, not as an elderly widow who needed protection and guidance, but as an accomplished woman whose opinions carried weight based on her knowledge and experience. I think the most interesting question isn't whether technology will change art, but whether it will change who gets to participate in creating and collecting it, I said, settling back into my chair. When I started collecting seriously 30 years ago, the art world was controlled by a very small group of gatekeepers. Now, blockchain technology and digital platforms are creating opportunities for artists and collectors who would never have had access to traditional systems. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, ranging from cryptocurrency to contemporary sculpture to the politics of cultural preservation. When my guests finally departed, I felt the intellectual satisfaction I'd been seeking throughout my entire adult life. Carlos had stayed late to help Maria clear the dishes, and as we worked together in the kitchen, he mentioned something that caught my attention. "Victoria, have you given any thought to the dance showcase next month? Several of the Monaco cultural organizations are planning a joint event, and they've specifically requested that you participate." I looked up from the wine glasses I was rinsing. "What kind of participation?" "They want you to perform a solo piece. Apparently, word has spread about your terrace lessons, and people are curious about the American woman who moved to Monaco and immediately began hosting tango demonstrations for international society." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. 6 months ago, I'd been publicly shamed by my own son for taking dance lessons. Now I was being invited to perform for Monaco's cultural elite as a celebrated member of their community. What would I perform? I was thinking we could choreograph something that tells your story. A piece about transformation, about a woman discovering her power and refusing to apologize for it. The concept was perfect, using dance to express everything I couldn't say in words about my journey, from submissive widow to independent woman. A public declaration that I was no longer hiding my passions or diminishing my presence to make others comfortable. Let's do it. Over the following weeks, Carlos and I worked together to create a dance piece that was part autobiography, part artistic statement. The choreography began with movements that suggested constraint and conformity, gradually building to sequences that expressed liberation and power. We practiced for hours on my terrace, with the Mediterranean as our backdrop and Monaco's glittering skyline as our inspiration. The process of creating this dance was more therapeutic than years of grief counseling could have been. Every movement helped me process the anger, sadness, and ultimate triumph of the past year. By the time we'd finished the choreography, I felt like I'd literally danced my way into a new identity. The showcase was held at the Opera de Monte Carlo, a venue that had hosted some of the world's most celebrated performers. As I prepared backstage, wearing a custom-designed dress that was both elegant and dramatic, I felt none of the nervousness I'd expected. Instead, I felt a profound sense of rightness, as if everything in my life had been leading to this moment. The audience included many of the people who'd become my friends and colleagues over the past 6 months, along with Monaco's cultural leaders and several international visitors who'd heard about the event. As I walked onto that stage, I realized I was about to perform for people who saw me as an accomplished artist rather than an embarrassing old woman. The music began, and I allowed myself to become lost in the story the dance was telling. Every movement expressed something I'd been forced to suppress for decades: passion, power, sensuality, independence, an absolute refusal to apologize for taking up space in the world. When the performance ended, the applause was immediate and sustained. But more meaningful than the audience response was how I felt. Completely, authentically myself, for the first time in my adult life. As I took my bow, I noticed 2 familiar faces in the audience that made my heart skip. Sophie and Emma were sitting in the 3rd row, their faces bright with pride and amazement. They'd flown to Monaco to see their grandmother perform, something their parents would never have considered doing. After the show, they found me backstage, both talking at once in their excitement. "Grandmama, that was absolutely incredible," Sophie said, using the childhood name for me that I hadn't heard in years. "I had no idea you could dance like that. I had no idea you were so amazing." Emma was more direct, as she'd always been. "Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? The dancing? The house here? The art collection? Any of it? We thought you were just the sweet grandmother who baked cookies and hosted family dinners." The question was fair, and it deserved an honest answer. Because that's what everyone expected me to be, and I thought my job was to meet everyone's expectations rather than pursue my own interests. It took me 75 years to realize that I didn't have to choose between being a good mother and grandmother and being an interesting, independent woman. We talked for hours in my penthouse, with Sophie and Emma asking questions about my investments, my art collection, my decision to move to Monaco, and my plans for the foundation that would inherit most of my wealth. They were intelligent young women who understood immediately why I'd restructured my estate to support causes I believed in rather than funding their parents' entitled lifestyle. "We know about the criminal charges," Emma said quietly. "Dad tried to convince us that you'd been brainwashed by some kind of Monaco conspiracy, but we've seen the evidence. We know what they plan to do to you." Sophie's voice was tight with anger. "We're so sorry, Grandmama. We had no idea they were thinking that way about you, talking about you like you were some kind of burden instead of our brilliant, accomplished grandmother." Their apologies meant more to me than they could have known, because they came from genuine horror at their parents' behavior rather than from hope. "For financial gain, I want you both to know that your trust funds are secure," I told them. "Your inheritances were never dependent on your parents' behavior. You'll have everything you need to build whatever lives you choose for yourselves." But more importantly, I wanted them to see what was possible when women refused to make themselves smaller to accommodate other people's expectations. "I'd like you to spend some time here with me, if you're interested. Not as visits to your elderly grandmother, but as young women learning about independence and power from someone who took far too long to claim her own." They accepted immediately, and over the following weeks I introduced them to Monaco's international community, included them in cultural events, and shared the business knowledge I'd spent decades accumulating in secret. They thrived in this environment, revealing intelligence and ambition that had been stifled by their parents' narrow expectations. During their visit, Patricia called with another update on Jonathan's legal situation. "The plea negotiations have collapsed," she reported. Jonathan's attorney thought they could pressure the prosecutor into accepting a deal that would avoid prison time, but the DA's office is taking a hard line on elder abuse cases. They want to send a message that this kind of behavior has serious consequences. What does that mean for Jonathan? He's looking at a trial that could result in 5 to 7 years in federal prison. Melissa is facing similar charges, and their financial situation has deteriorated to the point where they're both filing for bankruptcy. I felt surprisingly little satisfaction hearing about their complete downfall. The anger I'd carried for months had gradually transformed into something closer to indifference. Jonathan had chosen to treat me as an obstacle rather than as his mother, and now he was facing the natural consequences of those choices. Have they made any attempts to contact Sophie and Emma? Constantly. Apparently, they're trying to convince the girls to intercede on their behalf, to ask you to drop the charges or provide financial assistance. The girls have been ignoring these requests. Sophie and Emma had made their own choices about their parents' behavior, and those choices reflected the values I'd tried to instill in them during their childhood. They understood that actions have consequences, and they weren't willing to enable their parents' continued attempts to avoid accountability. A month after their visit, I received an unexpected call from Jonathan himself. His voice was barely recognizable, strained with desperation and what sounded like genuine fear. "Mother, please. I know I made mistakes, but I'm facing prison. Real prison. We'll lose everything, the house, the cars, everything. Sophie and Emma will have nothing left of their family." The manipulation was obvious, but pathetic. Even facing criminal prosecution, Jonathan was trying to use his daughters as leverage to gain my sympathy and support. "Jonathan, Sophie and Emma are fine. They're intelligent, accomplished young women who are perfectly capable of building their own lives without depending on inherited wealth or their parents' social status. But the family, our family, everything Dad built, everything you built, it's all being destroyed because of one stupid comment I made at your birthday party." The revisionist history was stunning. In Jonathan's mind, his criminal conspiracy to have me declared incompetent and steal my assets had been reduced to one stupid comment that I was overreacting to. "Jonathan, this isn't about your birthday speech. This is about your attempt to commit elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to steal my autonomy and my life's work. You didn't make a mistake in the heat of the moment. You spent months planning to destroy my independence so you could access money you'd never earned. I was trying to protect you. Those dance lessons, this whole Monaco thing, it's not normal for someone your age. I was worried about you making decisions that would hurt you in the long run." Even now, facing prison and financial ruin, Jonathan couldn't acknowledge that my choices were legitimate expressions of my preferences rather than symptoms of mental decline. "Jonathan, I'm 75 years old. I've built a successful business empire, raised a family, and contributed to my community for decades. I think I'm qualified to decide how I want to spend my remaining years without requiring approval from someone who's been borrowing against my estate to fund his lifestyle." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "Mother, I'm begging you, please don't let them send me to prison. I'll do anything, agree to anything, if you'll just help me get through this." The desperation in his voice might have moved me 6 months ago, when I was still operating under the assumption that my primary obligation was to protect my family from consequences they'd brought on themselves. But the woman living in Monaco had learned something important about the difference between love and enablement. "Jonathan, I love you because you're my son, but I don't like who you've chosen to become. You decided to treat me like an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Now you need to face the consequences of that choice without my intervention. So you're just going to let me go to prison? Your own son? I'm going to let justice take its course. The same justice that would have protected me if anyone else had tried to steal my assets and destroy my independence." I hung up and immediately blocked his number. The conversation had confirmed what I had suspected. Jonathan was still focused on avoiding consequences, rather than accepting responsibility for his behavior. 6 months later, I stood on my terrace watching the sunrise over the Mediterranean while reading news coverage of Jonathan's trial verdict. He'd been convicted on all charges and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Melissa had received 4 years for her role in the conspiracy. The articles described the case as a landmark prosecution of elder abuse, with the district attorney emphasizing that attempts to exploit elderly family members would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I felt no satisfaction reading about their sentences, but I felt profound relief knowing that other elderly people might be protected from similar abuse because prosecutors were taking these crimes seriously. Carlos joined me on the terrace for our morning coffee, a ritual we'd established during his permanent move to Monaco as my business partner, in a new dance studio we'd opened for international residents. "Any regrets?" he asked, noting the newspaper in my hands. I looked around my penthouse, at the Mediterranean stretching endlessly toward the horizon, at the vibrant city of Monaco coming to life below us, at the dance studio plans spread across our outdoor table, where we'd been designing programs for accomplished older adults who refused to accept society's limitations. "None," I said, and meant it completely. My phone rang with a call from Sophie, who was now working for my foundation in New York while finishing her master's degree in nonprofit management. Emma had moved to London to study art history and was helping manage my European cultural investments. "Grandma Emma, I wanted to tell you about the response to our new elderly empowerment grants. We've received over 3,000 applications from women over 60 who want funding to pursue dreams they've been putting off for decades." The foundation I'd established with my inheritance was supporting exactly the kind of programs I'd envisioned, helping older women discover their power, pursue their passions, and refuse to accept diminished lives just because they'd reached a certain age. Any particularly interesting applications? There's a 78-year-old former teacher who wants to start a technology company, a 65-year-old nurse who's applied to medical school, and a 72-year-old grandmother who wants to open a motorcycle repair shop. These women understood what I'd learned, that age could be the beginning of adventure rather than the end of possibility. As I finished my call with Sophie, I realized that my transformation from obedient widow to independent woman had created ripple effects I'd never anticipated. The foundation was helping hundreds of women discover their own power. Sophie and Emma were building careers based on their own talents rather than inherited wealth. Even the criminal prosecution of Jonathan and Melissa had established legal precedents that would protect other elderly people from similar exploitation. The woman who'd been publicly humiliated for taking tango lessons had become someone whose life inspired others to reject limitations and pursue their dreams regardless of age or social expectations. That evening, I hosted another dinner party, this one celebrating the first anniversary of my Monaco residency. The guest list included friends from 6 countries, ranging in age from 30 to 85, all of whom had chosen to build lives based on their own values rather than conventional expectations. As we raised our glasses in a toast to new beginnings, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from finally living authentically. Jonathan had called me embarrassing for refusing to behave like a traditional elderly widow. He'd been right about one thing. I was embarrassing to people who wanted to keep older women invisible and diminished. But I'd learned that being embarrassing to the wrong people was actually a sign that you were finally doing something right. The woman dancing on the terrace that night, surrounded by friends who celebrated rather than criticized her independence, was exactly who I'd always been underneath the roles everyone else had required me to play. At 75, I'd finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. And it felt absolutely magnificent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.